All right. Our first webinar of this academic year is about electric vehicles, or EVs. EVs are increasing in popularity and are a good choice for those who need personal transportation. This presentation will cover the basics of EV ownership, including charging, long-distance travel, and performance in hot and cold weather. Our speaker will also dispel some common myths that are circulating in mainstream and social media. This presentation will then be followed by a Q&A session that allow you plenty of opportunity to ask any questions you may have. Our speaker today is Mr. Raymond Lurie. Raymond has always been interested in science and environmental issues. 12 years ago, he bought his first EV, which eventually led him to become a member of the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa, or the EVCO, of which he is now president. His interest in environmental issues was rekindled when he attended Al Gore's Climate Reality course in 2017. Now retired from a long IT career, Raymond pursues his passion by spending much of his time researching and advocating for EVs and other climate change solutions. After Raymond's presentation, I'll facilitate the Q&A period. So for now, Raymond, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll share my screen here and put the presentation on. So thank you very much again for inviting me to present. And so again, I'm Raymond Lurie, president of the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa. Who are we? Well, we're a small nonprofit volunteer-run group of EV owners that are promoting electric vehicles. Why are we doing this? It's pretty straightforward. They're EVs. If you've owned one, we'll know that they're actually a better solution to the personal transportation problem, and they're environmentally more friendly than conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. So what we do is we talk about EVs to the public. We also do some promotion with policymakers, advocacy with policymakers, and the idea is to decarbonize the economy. And as you probably have seen before, these are numbers for 2021 for Canada, and transportation in 2021 contributed 22% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a fairly large chunk of our emissions. And if you think about the impact of reducing those emissions, there's also an impact on the oil and gas sector. So oil and gas is a very large portion of our emissions in Canada, and a lot of that comes from Alberta. So if you look at the transportation emissions, that's the transportation emissions at the tailpipe of the vehicle in question. Now the upstream emissions, some of them are in the oil and gas production processes and all that. So extraction, processing, and distribution of the fuel. And given that there's a significant portion of that what's produced in Canada that's used in Canada, that portion would also add on to the amount of greenhouse gases generated by the transportation sector. So if you look at the individual footprint, so from an individual perspective, there are really three areas that contribute the most to the emissions that you are personally doing. So heating of water and space is a big one. Transportation is also a significant emitter. And then red meat and dairy are another emitter. So if you were to eliminate all three of those, you would be able to reduce your personal footprint from somewhere between 80 to 90%. So why are we focusing on the transportation sector in our case? Is because it's, from our perspective, it's a very easy thing to do, and it contributes a significant amount of emissions reductions. So before we talk about pure electric vehicles, what I'd like to talk about is some other solutions that are considered green technologies. So hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and hydrogen-powered vehicles. And just talk about those briefly, and then we'll get back to EVs. So conventional hybrids, they were introduced about 25 years ago. The Prius was the first hybrid that was introduced. At that time, they do save fuel. There's no doubt that they save some fuel, so it's better than not having a hybrid. However, it's still a fossil fuel burning car, so it still emits lots of GHGs, and there are all sorts of issues with the fact that a gas car is much more complex than and a hybrid in particular is much more complex than a conventional gas car. And both of those are more complex than an EV, so they're more difficult and more costly to maintain. So the next group is, this is a more recent addition. The first one of the plug-in hybrids that came out is the Chevy Volt that came out probably about 15 years ago. What those have is a small battery, and they have a gas engine. So the idea is that the vehicle will run in EV mode for a certain distance, and the distance, depending on the model, will vary from 20 to 100 or so kilometers. In China, actually, they have other vehicles that do much more than that. But the point is that once you've run out of electricity, there's a motor that's in there in the vehicle to generate electricity to get you further. So that gives you more range with a smaller battery. Okay, so this, from our perspective, is a bridge technology, and it made a lot of sense when batteries were very expensive. So when the Chevy Volt was designed, what they did there is they said they estimated the cost of the battery, and if they were to make a fully battery electric vehicle at that time, the cost of the battery would have been prohibitive, so the car would have been unaffordable. So what they did is a compromise where they put a smaller battery and they put a gas engine to give you more range if you needed more range. Okay, so it's really a transition technology that we feel is past due, if you will. Briefly about hydrogen, don't want to talk about this too much. I'll be happy to answer questions later about it. But if you look on the right-hand side, that's an illustration of what you need to do to use hydrogen to power a vehicle. And bottom line is, if you take a certain amount of electricity and you run it through the process you see on the right-hand side there, you may get to, say, for example, 100 kilometers of range with the hydrogen in question. If you take that same electricity and you put it directly into the battery electric vehicle, you'll get 3 to 4 times further. Okay, so the issue here is that if you look at it from a basic economics point of view, the hydrogen vehicle has a disadvantage in that the energy required to produce the hydrogen is 3 or 4 times that's required to power the battery electric vehicle. So it's got a significant economic disadvantage that's really impossible to overcome, because the barriers have to do with physics and chemistry, and these are things that unfortunately we can't change the laws of physics and chemistry. So for that and other reasons, if you think about all the kit that's required on the right-hand side, that costs money. So for all those reasons, hydrogen is much more expensive than battery electric, and we don't see that changing anytime ever, actually. So now back to electric vehicles, pure battery electric vehicles. So some of the advantages that they have is that they're 3 or 4 times more energy efficient. So that's compared to gas vehicles. Okay, so if you look at the efficiency of a gas engine, diesels are a bit better, but a conventional gas engine, about 80% of the energy is lost in heat. There's only 20% that's actually used to propel the vehicle. With an electric vehicle, about 80% or more of the energy is used to propel the vehicle. So you get 3 or 4 times more bang for the buck for the energy buck, right? And if you look at what that means on the lower left-hand side in terms of costs, and we'll talk about costs, an example with Alberta specifically in a few slides. But bottom line is that the cost of the fuel, so the cost of the electricity, is substantially less than the cost of the equivalent gas or diesel. So there's money to be saved with an EV. So some of the other advantages, lower maintenance costs. So EVs have very few moving parts and tend to not break down very much. They could be used as backup power sources for emergencies. So if you look at this particular example here, we had a derecho. It's a type of storm that caused lots of power outages here in Ottawa 3 or 4 years ago. And this particular example is one of my colleagues who used his car to power his fridge, his freezer, and some electronics. Of course, the internet's the most important service in the house, right? So, and he was able to do that for a considerable amount of time. And then he did that at his in-laws' place. And for a week, he was able to power their appliances, and it took only 10% of the battery. So that gives you an idea of how much energy there is in these vehicles and how much that could be used for backup purposes, and we'll see there's other purposes we could use it for later. You get a quiet, smooth ride. You get instant, fast acceleration at any speed. So electric motors give you 100% of the torque at zero. So it's not like a gas engine where you have to rev to 2,500 RPM or so before you get the full power. And there is turbo lag if you have a turbo and all that. There's none of that with an electric vehicle. You get the full power at any speed. You could wake up with essentially a full tank of fuel every day. So that's what I do when I get home. I plug my vehicle in. Next morning, I've got essentially a full tank of fuel. They're very inexpensive to fill, and this depends on the rates you pay. But in my case, we have in Ontario something called ultra-low overnight rates, which means that I pay about 7 cents or actually 6 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity that I put into my EVs. So it means that I could essentially fill up completely the vehicle if I was doing that. For somewhere around $3. Okay, you could also do preconditioning, and this you could schedule in the vehicle. So you could schedule the vehicle so that if you leave at 8 o'clock every morning, the vehicle will be preheated or pre-cooled at that time for when you leave. Okay, and one of the advantages there is that that's done using power from the home, not from the battery. So it's one of the ways if you're driving in cold weather to get more range, because you're not using some of the range to do that. Okay. So let's talk about charging a bit, and just to an overview of the charging levels here. So there's really 3 charging levels. Level 1 is just 120 volt circuit, and with that you get 6 to 10 kilometers of range per hour of charging. The average Canadian, although we have a very big country, we tend to think we drive a lot, but the average Canadian drives 42 kilometers a day. Which means that within a few hours, you could recharge the day's electricity that you've used on a regular 120 volt circuit. And Art Hunter, who's on the call here, he has 2 EVs, and he's never used anything but level 1 at home. And that does what he needs for his purposes. That being said, normally we recommend to use level 2, so 240 volt EVSE, we call it, electric vehicle supply equipment. That gives you more power for typically 40 to 60 kilometers of range per hour of charging. You could get more than that, but that's a typical of what you would get. And again, there, if you're driving an average of 42 kilometers a day, that's just 1 hour to recharge the vehicle. So that gives you flexibility as to when you may want to, or when you could charge the vehicle. Level 3 is also known as DCFC, so DC fast charging. Those are chargers that you would use if you're doing a long trip. So I went to Halifax last year with one of my EVs, and along the road I used DC fast charging to be able to do the trip much faster. Okay, so for level 1 and 2 charging, those are AC systems. So these are the type of systems you would have in your home. So AC is alternative current, right? And the North American standard at the moment is a plug called a J1772, which you see there in the picture on the top. We're moving to the Tesla plug in North America. Okay, so and we'll talk a bit about that a bit more in a few slides, but essentially the SAE J3400 is the future plug that we'll be using, and that will make it easier because we'll have only one plug. Now, at the moment, there are adapters that will allow you to interoperate between the J1772 and the J3400. So if you have a car that's got the old plug, it's not an issue. You can use an adapter, okay? Okay, so if you look at filling up away from home, so level 3 or DCFC, the charging is these chargers are much more powerful. So typically, an EV will take 20 to 40 minutes to charge. Now that depends on the EV and depends on the charger. There are some cases, if you look at the vehicle in the illustration there, that's a Hyundai Ioniq 5. It will charge from 10 to 80% in 18 minutes. Okay, so normally when you're doing a long trip, you will charge from about 10% to about 80%. The reason for that is charging from 10% to 80% takes about the same amount of time as charging from 80 to 100. So if you're past 80%, you might as well go to the next charger and charge over there. So if you want to minimize the amount of trip the amount of time your trip is going to take. And again, these plugs, there's a different plug that's being used by this particular vehicle. It's the CCS combo, it's called, but that's moving to the J3400, which is the Tesla plug. Okay, so this is what the Tesla plug looks like, and you can see there in the lower left-hand corner that it's much smaller than the CCS combo. That's the other plug that's in use right now in North America. So technically, it's actually a better standard. It costs less to produce. It's much better for someone who's got mobility issues. It's lighter and easier to manipulate. So it is technically the better choice, regardless of what you think about Tesla versus other manufacturers. It is technically the better choice. Other jurisdictions in other places in the world have done different choices, but here in North America, the manufacturers got together and decided that it would adopt this plug. Okay, and again, there are adapters that allow you to interoperate with all of these plugs. Now, car maintenance with an EV is quite a bit simpler. In terms of regular maintenance, really, there's not very much. So there's the tires, obviously, they will wear out like they will on any other vehicle. The brakes actually last 4 to 5 times longer. That's because of regen. So when you regenerate, when you take your foot off the accelerator, it will regenerate electricity. So the energy goes back in the battery instead of wearing out your brakes. Okay. A lot of the EVs today have 12-volt lead acid batteries for the electronics and for the lights and all that kind of stuff. Those could fail also. And these three are the most common things we've seen in terms of issues. So if you look at, if you look at the things that are not in an EV, you don't have an exhaust system or belts, or you don't need to do oil changes, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot less things that could go wrong, so a lot less maintenance that's required. Now here I did a comparison for specifically for Alberta, and I'm going to try to go a bit faster because I'm going to speak for too long otherwise. So on the left-hand side, you see for someone driving 10 to 15,000 kilometers, this is using the CAA cost calculator. And I'm comparing here a Toyota Camry to the vehicle we saw before, the Hyundai Ioniq 5. And you can see there that the cost difference is substantial. So it's about $1,500 less per year to run the Ioniq 5. Okay. Now, that being said, we'll talk a bit on the next slide about the cost, and the calculator actually underestimates the savings you could get with an EV. In particular, if you look at the bottom there, it talks about maintenance costs. It shows a maintenance cost that's potentially higher with the Ioniq 5 than with a Camry. And like I just said, maintenance, there's a lot less maintenance with an EV. So that number is not realistic. It should be lower than that. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, that's another estimate with someone who's driving more. So 25,000 to 30,000 kilometers per year. You can see the savings there is $2,700 or so, or $2,600. So it's a significant amount of money saved. And again, there, the costs for the electric vehicle are overestimated in my opinion. If you look at those costs here, these are the assumptions that the tool makes, right? So the assumptions for fuel, that's a bit high for Alberta in particular. I checked yesterday and the prices are around $1.10 a liter, so it's a bit less expensive than what the calculator has. But if you look at the average cost of electricity, what I found is that it's much, much cheaper than in Alberta. You're paying about 10 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity. So if you look at the electricity costs at the top there, $1,500, in reality, you're paying about a third of that. So it's about $500 a year to drive 25,000 to 30,000 kilometers. Okay. If you look from a greenhouse gas perspective, Alberta, so Saskatchewan has got a dirtier grid, if you will, than Alberta. Alberta is next in terms of how much emissions come from the grid. But if you look at the comparison there, you're still talking about 2/3 reduction in greenhouse gases with the Ioniq 5. Okay. So here, just want to point out that there's a lot of disinformation, misinformation out there. And misinformation and disinformation starts with a grain of truth. And I'll go rapidly through the example here. But what they do is they distort or exaggerate the impact. And one good example is cobalt and child labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So Amnesty International has found that there are some kids involved in mining cobalt in the DRC. So that's a problem, right? And EV batteries, the older ones in particular, use cobalt. So about 40% of the world's production in 2022 went into EVs. Okay, so of course nobody likes child labor. At least no reasonable person likes child labor. So the argument was, well, you shouldn't buy an EV because the cobalt requires child labor. Okay, well, you only hear about the context of this in the context of EVs. You don't hear about it in the context of other stuff. Meanwhile, there are other examples of sweatshops where conditions aren't great and we still buy those products, right? So if you look at the broader context, what they don't tell you is that smartphones, laptops, and all that, so the device you're using today to see this presentation likely has, if it's a portable device, it's got batteries that contain cobalt. And about 30% of world production in 2022, I think it's 2022, went into those types of devices, okay? The other thing they don't tell you is that the oil industry uses lots of cobalt to refine petroleum. So they use cobalt to remove sulfur from raw petroleum, okay? The other thing they don't mention is that batteries right now, the EV industry is going to a chemistry called LFP, lithium iron phosphate. So those batteries have no cobalt. And when I put this number there, 50%, actually, the number is actually probably closer to 75% now. So most vehicles today have LFP batteries, so they have no cobalt. Okay, so I've got two EVs. My newer EV has no cobalt in it. So if child labor is really of concern of yours, right, you shouldn't be buying any portable electronics, right, because those are one of the biggest consumers of cobalt. You should buy gas because to produce gas, you need cobalt, and there's child labor involved in cobalt. But maybe you should be buying an EV with LFP batteries where there's no cobalt, right? So if you look at the broader context, the information they provide is distorted, right? And there's really no reason to avoid buying an EV because of the cobalt content. And there's every reason to fight against child labor, whether it be for cobalt or anything else, okay? So here, rapidly, I'll go through the EV myths. So the first one here is that mining for minerals for EVs is worse than oil. And here, this is something that I've seen often in social media from Saskatchewan Proud, as you see at the bottom there, saying that, essentially saying that EVs are worse for the environment than oil. Well, you probably know, being for the most part Albertans, that this doesn't quite represent the truth. So this is false or misleading anyways. This is more what an oil sands production facility looks like. Yes, there is in situ mining of bitumen, but that mining actually requires lots of greenhouse gases, because what they do is they use natural gas and burn it to heat the rock to make the oil more fluid, so that they could collect it and bring it back to the surface. So it still results in lots of greenhouse gases, although it doesn't deface the ground as much as what you see in this picture here. And the mine at the top is actually not a lithium mine. The mine that you see here is a lithium mine, which represents a relatively small percentage, about 20% of world production. Most lithium comes from hard rock mining from Australia. Okay, and this mine, by the way, is a phosphate mine, and one of the byproducts is that they have lithium, so they use the lithium to make batteries. So over the lifetime of a gas car, about 17,000 liters are burnt. Okay, and if you look at an EV currently with battery densities that we have today, energy densities we have today, it takes about 160 kilograms more of elements to make an EV than it does to make a conventional car. Now, the batteries are recyclable. The fossil fuels aren't, right? So the extra GHG emissions from manufacturing an EV are made up after, depending on the situation, somewhere around 20,000 kilometers of driving. So typically a year or so of driving, okay? So if you put that in perspective, and again, I won't belabor this too much, but in terms of fossil fuels, remind about 21 billion tons of fossil fuels a year. So 21 billion tons. And the so-called green transition, where we're going to renewable energy and EVs and all that, will require somewhere on the order of 40 million tons of minerals, not annually, but total by the year 2040. So you can see that the scale is very, very different. Okay, and here I'll skip this right now because in this also because of time. So second myth is that EV batteries will need replacing. Well, my first EV, which I bought in 2013, lasted, well, I changed it after 10 and a half years. It had 315,000 kilometers on it, and I still had 85% of battery capacity. So the battery was still good after 10 years and 315,000 kilometers. So this is typical of what we're seeing. There are batteries that need to be replaced. That happens. Every product has got some manufacturing defects, but generally speaking, we expect the batteries to outlast the cars. Redwood Materials, which is the biggest recycler of lithium-ion batteries in North America, what they've started doing is instead of just recycling the battery, they're actually reusing the battery for a second life, and they use that, generally speaking, for static storage. But bottom line, though, is they're recyclable, and they're being recycled right now actively in North America. Myth number 3, EVs take too long to charge. So I mentioned already that the car right there will charge from 10 to 80% in 18 minutes. And most of the charging is done overnight anyway. So in my case, at least 90% of my charging is done at home. So what I tell people is it takes me literally 10 seconds to charge my EV, because it takes only a few seconds to plug it in when I get home and only a few seconds to unplug it when I leave. And otherwise, I don't need to worry about it because I'm sleeping or doing something else. Okay. Myth number 4, EVs don't have enough range. This is an example. The numbers are a bit out of date here, but they're still representative. So the Chevy Silverado EV, over 700 kilometers of range, and down to the Kona there at 420. So my newest EV that I've bought has got a range of 400 kilometers, and that's an EV I bought specifically to travel. So 400 kilometers, from my perspective, is more than enough to be able to travel long distance. Myth number 5, there's nowhere to charge. So here, this is from PlugShare. So if you look at plugshare.com, you'll be able to see the charging stations that exist in anywhere in the world, really. And here I've got only the stations that are DC FC, so level 3 chargers. And you can see how many there are, right? So these are locations. They're not, most of these, or most, if not all of these locations, will have more than one charger, but these are the locations. And as you can see somewhere down on the map there, I can't see it on the screen myself. Oh yeah, right there. So 377 charging locations in this map. Okay, so you don't see charging normally. You don't notice it because they don't advertise charging. Why don't they advertise charging? It's because the car will tell you, or an app will tell you where to go to charge. You don't have to look for a big sign, so they don't bother putting a big sign up. Myth number 6 is EVs just shift pollution to coal power plants. Well, the example here, I was looking for Alberta numbers and wasn't able to get good information. But just to give you an illustration here, in Ontario, there's no coal anymore. In Alberta, you just closed the last coal plant. So the Albertan electricity system emits a lot more than an Ontario one, but still, as we saw earlier, it results in about a third of the emissions overall than what you would have with a gas vehicle. And you probably know that wind and solar are the least expensive sources of energy, despite what some politicians would like you to believe. So myth number 7, the grid can't handle everyone switching to EVs. So here, again, the example is from Ontario, but it's very similar in Alberta, very similar everywhere, actually. So this is in the middle of winter a few years back, and you could see the dotted line is the forecast for the demand in Ontario, and the forecast in blue for the overall market demand, which means it's demand in Ontario plus what Ontario exports. So Ontario typically exports 1 to 2 gigawatt of electricity on a continuous basis to mostly the northern U.S. So the dotted line is the forecast, and the full line is the actuals, and you can see that this is relatively quite predictable. And you can see from season to season that things always sort of turn out similar. So it's quite easy to predict what the demand will be. And you could see that there's some periods of time like here where the demand drops quite a bit. Well, that happens to be in the middle of the night when most people are charging their EVs. Okay, so the EVs, well, what they'll do is that, actually, let me bring up the the rest of the stuff here. So the hydro companies have been planning for this for a while. I've talked to many of them at conferences, and they've been thinking about this for a long time. So the idea is that EVs will be soaking excess capacity that we have at night. You probably know that wind produces more at night, and we tend to curtail wind. That's certainly what's happening in Ontario. So we waste energy that otherwise we could put into vehicles. The grids, everybody that I've talked to say that the grid could support about 25 to 30% of the current vehicles. If they were electrified, the grid would be okay to support that. Beyond that, we need to do more stuff, more work. StatsCan is evaluating that 10 million vehicles will have an impact of 5 to 10%. So that's 10 million overall in across the country would have an impact of only 5 to 10% in terms of increased demand on the grid. And there's a technology called vehicle to grid that's emerging now. That what that will do is that you see there's some peaks here. So in Ontario, in the winter, we have a peak in the early morning and we have a peak in the afternoon and early evening. So what you could do with vehicle to grid is you could return energy back to the grid during those peak times, and you could charge during the slow times. So that will allow us to use vehicles to avoid having to add capacity to the generation network. Okay. Myth number 8, EVs don't work in the cold. Well, it's actually quite the opposite. They always start. I actually have a friend who's had the dubious pleasure of boosting gas vehicles with his EV when it was very cold here in Ottawa. And one point, though, is that you get near instant heat. So with a gas vehicle, especially if it's very cold, it'll take several minutes before you get some heat from the engine to warm the cabin. In the case of an EV, it's got either resistive heating or a heat pump that will give you heat almost instantaneously. Okay. You could also precondition the car, which means that you could either heat or cool the car depending on the season on a schedule. And that means in particular, in the winter, that you don't need to scrape your windshields. And myth number 8, EVs always catch fire. So this is a common one. Every time there's an EV fire, it's front page news. But in reality, this comes from an auto insurance firm. EVs actually catch fire much, much less frequency than gas vehicles. It's actually the hybrid vehicles that tend to burn more often. Why is that? It's probably because they're more complex than either of the two other types of vehicles. So things could break more, and so there's a bigger chance of fires with those vehicles. Myth number 10, EV sales are in decline. This is an interesting one. So what we're seeing actually is that the sales of combustion vehicles have declined, not the sales of EVs. In last year, 1 in 7 or so new cars was or had a plug. Okay, and in 2025, so sales have dropped off since January. We could talk about that afterwards during the Q&A in Canada, but overall, globally, sales are still increasing considerably. And actually, it's 1 in 4 new cars globally that will be a plug-in this year. And demand continues to grow everywhere on the planet, with the exception of here in North America at the moment. So if you look at the worldwide market share in 2025, passenger cars, so about 1 in 4 will be EVs this year. If you look at buses, 43% of new buses are electric. I know that you have some in Edmonton, some electric buses in Edmonton. I'm not sure if there's any in Calgary, but what we're seeing is a large trend going towards electric buses for a whole bunch of reasons. Diesel is particularly harmful to people's health, so replacing diesel engines with battery electric makes a lot of sense and reduces particulate matter pollution in particular. 2 and 3 wheelers, so these are particularly pertinent in Asia. So if you look at India and China in particular, they have lots of 2 and 3 wheelers. In China, they've already done most of the transition to electric, but India is getting on that bandwagon right now. And the 2 and 3 wheelers typically use 2-stroke engines, which are particularly bad at producing pollution and emissions of all sorts. So replacing those with electric vehicles will make a huge difference in terms of the pollution in large cities in Asia. Now, on the left-hand side, you'll see vans and trucks. It's only at 8% at this time. What we're seeing, though, in China at the moment, a very rapid increase in the adoption of EV trucks. And the same is happening in Europe, and it's a matter of time that it will happen here. And I believe that vans and trucks will actually overtake passenger cars within a few years. The reason for that is that when we're talking about passenger cars, you're talking about people and their concerns and fears and feelings about the vehicle, whereas when you're talking about vans and trucks, it's typically some account that counts how much it costs to run the vehicle, and they rapidly find out that it's much cheaper to run an electric vehicle. So we expect that the fleets will be converting to electric transportation quite rapidly. So, and if you want more information on this, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, they have Electric Vehicle Outlook 2025. They publish that every year. They publish an update, and they've got lots of other very interesting data about what's happening outside of North America in particular, where actually most of the action is happening at the moment with electric vehicles. So on that, I'd like to thank you and open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Appreciate that. So at this point, I am going to ask everyone if there are any questions. I'll invite you to use your raise your hand function, or you can type your question or comment in the chat. I do see one hand up, but before that, there was a question that was asked earlier on that I don't want us to miss. It's from DMC. And they were curious about what amount of the 22% transportation pollution is autos versus aircraft.
Autos, okay. It's about half is autos. So the rest is other types of transport like trucks and buses and trains. And an aircraft is a relatively small portion. So if you look at overall emissions worldwide, so I don't know the number for Canada in particular, but worldwide, aircrafts account for about 2%. Now, without going into too much details, what we're expecting is as battery densities continue to increase, it will become, it's already feasible to do short and medium haul flights with battery electric planes, believe it or not. And we expect that will continue to improve. So we expect that there'll be a significant portion of that will be electrified in the relatively near term, in the next 2 decades or so.
Thank you, Raymond. Art, you have your hand up. I just ask you to unmute yourself and please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. It's more of a comment that I like to deep dive into battery life, and I did discover some time ago the battery research lab at Dalhousie University. I put the link into chat so anybody can go and take a look. They're really world-class folks there, and I, from that, have used my charging cycle. I do not charge more than 72% of the charge capacity based on their research, and I never let it go below 20% charge. And based on that, according to their curves and their R&D, I'm going to get at least 200 years of lifetime out of my battery. I hope I'm around to change it.
Now, that being said, just to repeat that, so Dalhousie University, Dr. Jeffrey Don, he's a world expert on batteries, and as Art has said there, he's done lots of research on battery longevity in particular, and he's got some batteries that he's been cycling for years now. He's been charging and decharging for years, and they're still going strong. So he estimates that batteries that were common 10 or so years ago would have a lifetime of 5 million kilometers or more. And why isn't he saying 10 million kilometers? It's because he hasn't done enough cycles yet to show 10 million kilometers of range. So, like I said in the presentation, we don't expect to have to replace batteries. There are exceptional cases where there are manufacturing defects. That happens, but most batteries will outlast the cars.
Thank you. I believe, Emmanuel, you had your hand up, and then we'll go take some questions in the chat.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. My camera is not working for some reason, sorry. So thank you, Raymond, for your presentation. I'm just curious because here in Alberta, which you talked about, it's huge. And especially you look at Northern Alberta, I'm just thinking, if you drive from here to Fort McMurray, after Wandering River, for example, it's a long stretch, nothing. So how ubiquitous are the charging stations in Northern Alberta, for example?
Okay, so depending on where you are in Alberta, and actually Saskatchewan is in a worse situation, but Alberta and Saskatchewan don't have many EVs yet, and the governments there are not particularly supportive of EVs. So there aren't that many charging locations. But again, if you look at plugshare.com, you'll be able to see how many locations there are. There are quite a bit of locations. For example, I know someone who was as far back as 8 or so years ago was traveling from Victoria to Alaska with his EV. It's possible, definitely possible to travel across the country with an EV. Many people have done that. I've been from Ottawa to Halifax, so that's a round trip of, I believe, 3,600 kilometers, and no issues, right? So for me, what I tell people is that what really matters is not so much the range of the car, it's the range of my bladder, okay? So I have to stop every 2 or 3 hours anyways. And so I charge when I stop, and I take the opportunity to go to the toilet and eat a meal or something, right? So if you look at the overall amount of time that it adds in your trip, it's not that much. It's not as much as you would think, because you're using much of that time for some other purpose. If you're pumping gas, you have to stay at the pump while you're pumping the gas. When you're charging your car, you plug it in and then you go and you do what you want. You come back when you're ready to go, right?
Okay. So one quick follow-up question. What did you say was the range if you charge the battery up to 80%? How many kilometers roughly can you drive before you?
So that really depends on the car. So so if you look at the car that I was saying, the newest one I have has got a range of 400 kilometers. So when I went to Halifax, for example, I would drive about 250 to 300 kilometers between charges, right? So and that's the interval at which I needed to stop anyways. So it wasn't a significant issue. Okay, but again, like I said, in the list of vehicles there are some that have much more range. So the Silverado EV in particular has got 750 kilometers of range, which is crazy range in my opinion. What I would prefer if I was to buy a Silverado EV is that they put a smaller battery and charge me less for the vehicle. I think that much range is becoming excessive. Now, if you're towing something, that's a bit of a different story. So you want to have more range because towing something will reduce your range, right? But otherwise, for a regular vehicle, 400 kilometers is to me, the sweet spot. Less than that becomes a bit of an issue. More than that is just too much, and you end up paying for it in the cost of the vehicle.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and then I also see we have a few more hands raised, and we'll try to get to everybody. So we have a question from Graham. Raymond, Graham is asking if you could please talk a bit more about why you recommend level 2 charger over a level 1 charging.
Okay, so that's interesting question. So if you could do level 1 charging and it works for you, that's fine. There's really no issue with doing that. The reason we recommend level 2 is because of the extra flexibility it gives you. So for example, in Ontario, we have ultra low overnight rates, which apply between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. I believe Alberta's got similar rates now, time of use rates. So what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to charge during a period of time when you pay less for electricity. So if you're charging on 120 and you need to charge for 10 hours, then you might not be able to restrict your charging to that period, right? So that's really the main reason that we recommend that. The other reason is that generally speaking, it's more level 2 chargers are manageable, whereas level 1 chargers are not. So if you're looking at situations like condos or multi-unit residential buildings, rentals and all that, using level 2 is almost a must, because you want to be able to manage when charging occurs, so that you don't want everybody, for example, to get home at 5 o'clock at night and charge at the same time at maximum power, because then you increase the peak at that time of the day, and that causes all sorts of other effects, right? So what you want to do is you want to be able to charge them at night and control which how many get charged at the same time to not exceed the capacity of the building and so forth, right? Now, the other reason is something that's a future thing that's emerging. I talked about vehicle to grid. So now there are some charging stations that are available that will permit you to feed the grid as much as take electricity from the grid, and that will become an important technology going forward, and that requires a 240 volt to be able to support that.
Thank you very much. And before we take questions from the folks that have their hands up, there was one more in the chat from James. James has been hearing that the vehicle manufacturers are revising their EV plans due to slower than expected consumer demand, higher costs, and infrastructure challenges. Any thoughts on why that may be, and what to make of it?
Well, that's a really complicated question to answer, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. So Honda, okay, so Honda has said they had planned a very large investment in Ontario to build batteries and build EVs, and they decided to postpone the investment. Okay, they said that they postponed the investment because of softening demand for EVs. Well, Honda does not make an EV that they sell in North America. Okay, they sell one EV, and it's made by GM. Okay, so what they'll tell you publicly is what they want you to think about what they're doing. Okay, now if you look at other companies, Ford, for example. Well, Ford has got only a few EVs they sell in North America, but they have more in Europe that they potentially could be selling here, but they're not. Why aren't they doing that? Not sure, but they're not. The manufacturers, in other words, have an interest in making you think that the transition to EVs is costly and problematic for them. I'm not saying that it's not, because it's a very risky thing. This is something that the auto industry has never done before. It's like going, not quite as difficult, but similar to going from horse and buggy to cars, and they just don't know how to manage that transition. And if you look at similar situations you've seen in the past with Kodak in particular, Kodak actually invented digital cameras, but they still couldn't manage their transition, and they went bankrupt. Right, so the manufacturers are being very hesitant, very risk averse in what they're doing, and that's understandable, because you want to protect your profits and all that kind of stuff. But reality is, if you look at the overall world situation, and actually, if you look in what countries that people were saying before that would be the last ones to adopt EVs. China, Thailand, Vietnam, countries like that, they're actually adopting EVs very, very rapidly. Ethiopia has banned the import of gas cars. Okay, Ethiopia, a country that's much, much less prosperous than us, right? I can understand why manufacturers are reluctant to move fast, but I think that that's a problem because you look at Ontario and the auto industry in Ontario, which is a significant portion of our heavy industry here. If they don't move with the times, they're going to get left behind like Kodak was, right? So they need to step up their game and need to, in my opinion, step on the accelerator and not slow things down. Now, there's some issues with what's happening down south that's causing lots of problems, specifically for North American manufacturers. But reality is, in some markets already and in some categories already here in North America, EVs are cheaper to buy than the equivalent gas vehicle, and they're much cheaper to operate. So what are people going to do? People don't like wasting money, so they're going to go for the cheaper or less expensive solution. And like I said earlier, if you've lived with an EV for a while, like I have, I've been driving electric for 12 years, an EV is actually a better car. Okay, it's a better car for a bunch of reasons. So, if it's a better car, it costs less to buy it, and it costs less to fuel it and maintain it. Why would you ever keep buying gas cars, right? So, this movement is going to happen regardless of what happens in the U.S. So we need to be on the train, or we're going to miss out on the opportunity, right?
All right, we have time for one more question, and I believe Gary. So Wendy and Elizabeth, just in the interest of time, I see you have your hands up as well. I invite you to send us your questions, and I'll be happy to pass them on to Raymond and connect you to with Raymond. Gary, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is kind of like two parts. I didn't see, like when you were talking about electric vehicles, you talked about the Hyundai and a few other brands. Mm-hmm. I'm a Toyota person, so I've always bought Toyotas, and I'm wanting to get the electric ones. Living in Alberta, it seems to be a real problem with them wanting to do that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So my question is, like the Chinese technology seems to be emerging. I'm hearing lots of very interesting things about that. And I guess the question I have is with Toyota, is Toyota doing their part to bring on the electric vehicles so that they are on par with other ones, or I didn't.
So Japan and the Japanese companies as a whole have been lagging in the move to electrification. Okay, why have they been lagging as a group? It's because at some point in the past, probably about 30 years ago, the Japanese government decided that the only solution to have a so-called green vehicle or zero tailpipe emissions was hydrogen. Okay.
Oh.
At the time, it made sense because it was the only technical solution we had. The only problem was, and still is, that it's much more expensive to build such a vehicle and run a vehicle like that, right? Now, batteries weren't that good back then, and we didn't have batteries that were practical for EVs. That only happened, a bit over 10 years ago, when the price of and the energy density got high enough to make it practical, okay? But the Japanese are still pursuing hydrogen, and Toyota actually. This is an interesting case, in terms of what is the auto industry doing in Canada. Until recently, Toyota they had the BZ4X, which was their only fully electric vehicle sold in North America. You could only buy it in BC or Quebec. Why? Because BC and Quebec have an availability standard, which the federal government just postponed the equivalent. So they have an availability standard. So Toyota is compelled to sell electric vehicles in those markets. So they would only ship them to those markets. I talked to the biggest Toyota dealer in Eastern Ontario, who was in Ottawa, and they were trying to get those vehicles in their dealership because they wanted to sell them. And Toyota said, no, you can't have them. Now, Toyota is going through, they're discontinuing the BZ4X, and they're reintroducing it as the BZ. Strange name, but anyways, not my choice. But that one, my understanding is you could order it, at least in Ontario. I don't know about Alberta, but it's you could order it outside of Quebec and BC. But when the industry says that they can't sell EVs, and you're Toyota and you only sell them in Quebec and BC, If you were someone from Ontario and you went to a Quebec dealer and tried to buy a BZ4X, they would tell you no. Right? So if you're not even trying to sell the vehicle, period, how can you claim that you're not able to meet a sales target, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so, but this is a problem with all the Japanese manufacturers, and I'm concerned because if you look at market share of Japanese vehicles in China, in particular, and other parts of Asia, their market is falling apart. So Nissan's already on the brink of financial issues, and I suspect that there's others that will follow that. And my concern is that within a few years, I expect that Nissan and Mazda in particular won't be around. They won't be able to make the transition.
Okay, what about the China technology perception that I have? I have this perception that China has been sitting back. Everyone's talking about everyone else, and then I'm hearing like they have like vehicles that are automated that Tesla couldn't resolve or solve.
Gary, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Just in the interest of time, I just want to give folks an opportunity to get back to their next segment because we're coming to the top of the hour. I'm so sorry, but Gary, I'm happy to connect you with Raymond after this this webinar. Can I just want to take the time to once again thank you, Raymond, and thank you to everybody who attended.